Welcome to the lecture on Permaculture Principles. So Permaculture Principles are, little rules to go by, little kind of rules. We'll talk more about what they are in a minute, but they're little rules in which guide your design, and they were developed by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren and others. And they were developed from observation of nature. They were developed on how ecosystems work and how nature works, and how can we take those basic principles of nature and apply them to systems that we build for people so that they have the stability, diversity, and resilience of natural ecosystems, human designed systems. And a lot of them are have something to do with the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law, and it's a primary consideration in permaculture. And the entropy law can be stated in a couple of different ways. There are two laws of thermodynamics to be concerned with in permaculture design and in sustainability. The first law of thermodynamics says that no matter that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's eternally cycled from one form to another. And energy is a primary factor in sustainability because it takes energy to do anything. It takes energy even for our thinking. 20% of the energy in the body is used by the brain, and so it takes energy to make things. It takes energy to run things, and so energy is essential for sustainability. And if we have all we ever need, and the first law of thermodynamics says energy neither created nor destroyed. You'd think, well, sustainability is assured because, we just have all the energy. All the energy that's ever been created is still around. But there's a second law of thermodynamics that says that any time energy is transformed, it always transforms in a specific direction, and that direction is it spontaneously tends to flow from being concentrated in one spot to being dispersed and spread out. Let me give you a couple examples. If you take an egg and drop and break it over here, it doesn't jump up and unbreak on its own. So reactions tend to go in a particular direction. The air always leaks out of your tire and never back in. And so a lot of the principles having to do with cycling energy and stacking functions and things like that have to do with making the most use of that energy before, as it transforms and it becomes more entropic before it leaves your system. And really, energy, the fundamental property of energy that's essential for sustainable design and permaculture and sustainability is that it takes energy to offset the effects of entropy. Now we can put the energy back in our tire if it leaks out, but it takes energy to do that. And so we need energy for regeneration and renewal. And permaculture is essentially about making regenerative and renewing systems. So this idea, we need to obey the second law of thermodynamics. So Toby Hemenway, a friend of mine, who wrote the book Gaia's Garden, and I had a chance to work with him in Hawaii at the Bullock Brothers Farm and at the Bullock Brothers Farm in Orcas Island a little bit. And it's a great book on permaculture gardening. He's also written another book on permaculture, the permaculture city, applying permaculture principles in urban environments, which is also very interesting. But this is his understanding of principles. Permaculture principles are brief statements or slogans that can be remembered as a checklist when considering the complex options for design and evolution of ecological support system. These principles can be seen as universal, although the methods that express them will vary greatly according to place and situation. So, the principles that we're using in permaculture are those kind of universal principles that guide the growth and evolution and development of natural ecosystems. And the methods in which those are expressed will vary quite a lot depending on the climate and the culture and all those other things. But the underlying principles are universal. So fundamentally, permaculture design principles arise from a way of perceiving the world that can often be described as systems thinking and design thinking. And again, permaculture is a method of design. So I'll go through some of the permaculture principles. Some of these are from Toby and some of them are from Bill Mollison himself. So Responsibility to relinquish power, self-regulating system. The role of beneficial authority is to return function and responsibility to life and to people. And if successful, no further authority is needed. The role of successful design is to create self-managing systems. And here at Maharishi University of Management, the motto of the school is engage the managing intelligence of natural law. So the more that we can get nature to do for us in a self-organizing, self-regulating way, the less we need to do. Stress and harmony. Stress may be defined as either prevention of natural function or of forced function. Harmony is then the permission of chosen and natural functions and the supply of essential needs. So, if we're working against nature, that creates stress. If we're working with nature, that creates harmony. The prime directive from Bill Mollison. The only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. Core principle. This is again one of these fundamental principles that you see in a lot of the other principles, and that's every function is covered by many elements, and each element performs many functions. So we'll talk more about this, but I'll give you an example. An important function in any design is water for humans. So that function of water needs to be covered by many elements. So you might have rain catchment. You might have rain catchment in water tanks, in your house or near your house. You might have rain catchment on the landscape, and that might flow into ponds. You might have rain on the landscape that gets absorbed and stored in the soil, which is actually the cheapest and most abundant place to store water, useful place in a design. And then complementary principle, every element should perform many functions. So if we've got a water tank as an element, what other functions can we stack on top of that and design it to do? So could we turn it into, for example, a thermal storage bank for a greenhouse? So if we put the water tank in the greenhouse, then it's going to store some solar energy for use at night. Can we turn that water tank into a trellis that we can grow vines up? What other functions could we have for that water tank? So here's the rough organization of Toby's principles, and they're divided into three categories: primary principles for functional design, and these aren't Toby's principles; it's just his way of organizing them. And the second one is principles derived from living and energy systems. And then the third one is attitudes. And so let's go ahead and look at these in detail. So first we're going to start again in this area of primary principles for functional design. And functional design, a lot of times we think of design as something that's aesthetic, but functional design is design that helps to create habitats that meet human needs, so that provide energy, provide water. They're functional, they're beautiful, but they're also functional landscape. Functional design. Functional design is creating functional landscapes. So we're going to go through these principles. First, primary principles, functional design, and principles derived from living and energy systems and attitudes. So first one, observe. Use protracted and thoughtful observation rather than prolonged and thoughtless action. Boy, I certainly have done a lot of prolonged and thoughtless action in my life. Typical example of this is you get 200 trees to plant, and you go out with a shovel in one hand and a plant in the other, and you just start putting them anywhere. And then rather than before you get the plants, observe the landscape. Spend a couple seasons looking at what's going on, observe the soil, observe the way the water flows, and then with that protracted and thoughtful observation, think about where you're going to put everything before you just go out and start putting things all over the place. So observe the site and its elements in all seasons, designed for specific sites, clients, and climates. Connect. Use relative location. Place elements in ways that create useful relationships and time-saving connections among all parts. The number of connections among elements creates a healthy, diverse ecosystem, not the number of elements. So, just having a lot of random elements is not what creates kind of resilience. It's the number of connections. It's the way in which they're connected. So permaculture really is about how is energy connected to water, connected to food, connected to banking and money systems, connected to housing. How does everything connect? And what's the and really sustainability is about that the practical application of that interconnectedness and the intellectual exploration of it. And here at Monash University of Management, we have another way of connecting. We have a way of connecting with that universal source, the underlying unity of the surface diversity of life inside us through meditation. And so we have the direct experience of that interconnectedness of things through meditation, and then we have the practical application of it and the intellectual exploration of it through sustainable living. The direct experience is through meditation, and the practical applications through sustainable living and permaculture, of course. Permaculture being the core course for the sustainable living program. Here's an example of something that I designed. This is a toilet in a permaculture farm, teaching farm in Hawaii, and we wanted to use rain catchment to supply this toilet without having to use a pump. And so the rain catchment tank, the bottom of the rain catchment tank actually sits about this level, about 100 feet away. And so I realized that if I kept the toilet below the level of the tank, I could run pipes and the water would flow by gravity to these faucets into the toilet without using a pump. But because there was only this much difference in height between where the water was and where we needed to get it from, the pipes needed to be very big because there wasn't very much pressure. So therefore we have this huge pipe that brings the water down here. And then, again, relative location, if I put the sink above the toilet, when you wash your hands, the water from washing your hands will go in here and fill up the toilet tank, and then the next time somebody comes in, they can flush with the water that you use to wash your hands. So this is a little example of, if I didn't put these things in think about the relative location of these in terms of their height above each other in relationship to each other, I wouldn't have been able to pump the water for free. So in this system, you never have to worry about a pump breaking. Gravity is dead reliable. It's never going to stop working. So a third principle in functional design is catch and store energy and materials. Identify, collect, and hold the useful flows moving through the site. By saving and reinvesting resources, we maintain the system and capture still more resources. Again, this is one of those principles that's related to the second law of thermodynamics. We want to use energy and materials as they flow through our site. They'll inevitably become less useful to us as they flow through the site, but we want to use them as much as we can and use them at their highest use first. So what kind of things flow through a site? Well, water flows through a site. It comes by rain. Water comes out of your house and full of nutrients. So how can we catch and store this energy that's represented by this flowing water? And how can we use it, the energy that's represented by the really clean rainwater, until it becomes really dirty, and then how we purify it again on its way out? So these are how do we do that as many possible times? Another flow is the nutrients that cycle through plants, the nitrogen and phosphorus and calcium and potassium. How can we catch and store and cycle those in our plant systems? So here's an example. There's an Australian named P.A. Yeomans, and he wrote a book quite a while ago, at least in the 50s, maybe earlier than that, called Water for Every Farm. And he realized that if you took and you created structures, in this, you can see here that these are sort of on contour. So this is at the same level, like this point here is at the same level as this point over here. So these lines are on contour. And when the rainwater hits this and starts to flow down the site, then it's slowed by these structures on contour. They might be plantings, these might be swales or little ditches. And so as the water comes down, it's slowed and absorbed into the ground, and then again slowed and stopped and stored into the ground so that you can use it as many times as possible. Now it's not always possible to build structures like this, but an inexpensive way to do this is with what's called a yeoman plow. And what this does is it creates little slits in the soil. You can see these are about 18 inches or 2 feet apart. And you pull this on contour across the whole property. So in this case, you'd have a tractor here, and you'd have it marked out so it could follow on contour. It would have a device on the tractor that it would allow it to go on a level contour. and then you would do that across the whole hill. You wouldn't see it, but it would have the same effect because the water would channel into those little slits that were made by the plow. And these can be very, very effective. So another principle for functional design, each element performs multiple functions. Choose and place each element in a system to perform as many functions as possible. Increasing beneficial connections between diverse components creates a stable whole. Stack elements in both space and time. So we've talked a little bit about this already. This idea of stacking elements in space and time is, how many ways can we use this? In other words, how many functions can we stack on? Let's say we have a window. Well, if we place that window in the right place, not only are we going to be able to look outside through it, which is a intrinsic function of any window, but if we put it on the right side, we can have an added function that isn't intrinsic to every window, and that's that we can collect solar energy from the south side of a building. So how many functions can we stack on each element? How many different uses can we get out of that element by thinking about how clever we can be about where we place it in relationship to other elements? And we can do that both in space and time. And an example in gardens is you can plant several things at the same time. One thing which might mature really quickly, like maybe lettuces, and then something that's going to grow up and take longer and eventually overshadow the lettuces, like maybe tomatoes. You can plant them all in the same place, and that's an example of stacking in time. So each function should be supported by multiple elements. Use multiple methods to achieve important functions and create synergy. Redundancy protects when one or more elements fail. So what are important functions in your in a human habitat? Well, water's one, energy is one, food production is another. So all of those, we want multiple elements that support that function. So here's an example of one important element in a design being water, and this is at Kelly Custer's house on the corner of 4th and Broadway, which we'll visit on our permaculture bike tour of Fairfield. And so she is connected to the city, but in addition to city water, she has this rain catchment barrel, and you can see that there's a little, and again, relative location. It's located up here a little bit higher so that by gravity she can feed the water to her plants in various different places here. That's why it's set up high a little bit. And here's an example at the Eco Village, Abundance Eco Village, a project I designed. That's designed to be completely independent for water. So all the water supply for the whole village has to come from the rain that hits the surface of the land. Now there's 15 acres of land there. And so each acre in this area with 36 inches of rain, that's what we get a year, 36 inches of rain. That translates to about 1 million gallons of water per acre per year. So eventually there'll be about maybe 50 people living in Abundance Eco Village. And with 15 million gallons of water, there's plenty of water if they use it wisely. And so we have, this is an example of ponds that we store water in, and this here is an example of a tank. It's a 50,000 gallon tank, and that takes water off the roofs of the building, and stores it. Takes water off the roofs of about 6 or 7 buildings and stores it here, and then there's equipment that purifies it and pumps it and delivers it to each house. But you don't need super pure water for every use in your house. You don't need super pure water to flush your toilet or to water your plants. So we actually deliver a second grade of water that comes from these ponds, and here's an element that helps to purify. We pump the water with solar energy through this pond, which has plants in it and other things, and also is beautiful. And then that flows into the main pond, water storage pond, and we pump out of that pond and deliver it to the houses. So there's a second grade of water that goes to the washing machines, the outdoor faucets, the toilets, and we use the second grade water for that. And then the first grade water is the water that comes off the roofs that we keep very, very clean and use for the higher grade uses. So another function, a principle of functional design is make the least change for the greatest effect. Find the leverage point in the system and intervene there, where The least work accomplishes the most change. So make the least change for the greatest effect. Use small-scale intensive systems. Start at your doorstep with the smallest system that will do the job and build on your success with variation. Grow by chunking. So the idea here is that start small and build on success. So rather, I've done this many times. I mean, some of the first gardens I did were huge gardens that were hundreds of feet from any place I went regularly, and I'd put a lot of effort into getting it started, and inevitably a few weeks later or a month later it had been abandoned and just full of weeds and bigger than I could take care of and not anywhere near where I was. Now, the place I live now, I have a garden right outside the front door, and I walk by it 5 times a day, 10 times a day on my way to work, on my way home, and it's small. It's only about 4 by 10 feet, and it is just packed and productive. And I eat something out of that garden, every day, and I've got a little greenhouse over it, so I can eat something even in the wintertime off it. And again, start small and build on your success. As you build your skill, you can grow rather than try to do everything all at once. So another lesson I learned with this is planting trees. I've planted thousands of trees that have died because I didn't obey this rule. So disobey this rule, this principle, at your peril. Now we're going to turn to principles derived from living and energy systems. So the idea here is to use the next principle is use the edge effect. The edge, which is the intersection of two environments. So this could be the intersection between land and water. It could be the intersection between a forest and a meadow. It could be the intersection between a city and a countryside. So the edge, the intersection of two environments, is the most diverse place in a system. It is where energies and materials accumulate. So you want to optimize the amount of edge. So here's a way to think about it, and why that edge is so productive. And let's think about this habitat A, which has these 3 species, and habitat B, which has these 3 species. And where they come together, the place where the edge where they come together, you've got everything that's in B, everything that's in A, plus some things that only grow or only function or only lively where B and A overlap. So the edges, even culturally edges, think about edges, between, different kinds of music, or edges between different kinds of art. They're very productive and rich areas. So principles derived from living and energy systems, again, accelerate succession. So mature ecosystems are more diverse and productive than young ones, so use design to jumpstart succession. The idea here is you can plant early succession stuff at the same time as late succession stuff, and as the early succession stuff will grow up quickly and do its job, and you can cut that back and use it for mulch, and then the mature things will come up later. So accelerate succession. Use biological and renewable resources. Renewable resources, usually plants and animals, reproduce and build up over time, store energy, assist yield, and interact with other elements. Again, this is one of those principles that's related to the second law of thermodynamics. Biological systems can use solar energy to regenerate and renew and become more complex, because they can use solar energy to offset the effects of entropy. On the other hand, non-living systems can't do that. So if you buy a tractor, it's going to be the best it's ever going to be the day you buy it from the factory, and from there on out you're going to put energy and materials in it to slow the effects of entropy till eventually it becomes a pile of rust in a hole in the ground. But if you can use biological resources instead, oftentimes they self-replicate. They self-organize using solar energy. So whenever we can use biological resources rather than mechanical ones, it's usually more self-regulating, self-organizing, and over time less work for us. And here's an example of a chicken tractor. So you could use a rototiller or a shovel or something to prepare the ground for a garden bed, or you could just put some chickens in this little pen over it, feed them in there, and they'll, just by their nature of what they do, they will scratch, and they'll eat insects, and they'll eat all the weeds, and they'll turn that into fertilizer and manure. And so here we're using a biological resource rather than and there's one that looks like a tractor, rather than a mechanical resource. Recycle energy. Supply local and on-site needs with energy from the system. So get your energy from solar energy, from wind power, and reuse this energy as many times as possible. Every cycle is an opportunity for yield. And in permaculture, oftentimes we think of things like nutrients as energy that's flowing through the system. So supply the nutrients you need for your plant systems on site. As many things as you can, produce as many things as you can on site, so you don't have to bring things in from off site. It's more work, it costs money, and then you're sort of possibly degrading somebody else's site by taking their materials and energy and using them on your site. So now we're going to go on to the next class of principles called principles related to attitude. And so the idea here is turn problems into the solution. The problem is the solution, is what Bill Mollison would say. And we're used to thinking that problems are a huge issue in design, and that we don't want constraints. That constraints are a huge problem in design, but constraints actually can drive creativity. The hardest design to do is one where you're not given any constraint at all. You can design any kind of farm or factory on any piece of land in any climate. It becomes really difficult to do that. But if you say, okay, I want this kind of a house in this kind of a climate on this kind of a slope, then those constraints can drive the creativity for the solution. We are surrounded by insurmountable opportunities. Bill Mollison is famous for saying, when somebody was telling him about a problem they had with slugs in their garden, he said, "You don't have a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency." So in other words, you could turn the slug problem into an advantage by by bringing in ducks and having them eat the slugs, and then you've got, you're developing that resource of the ducks, and you're getting rid of your slugs at the same time. So the problem then of the slugs then becomes the solution. Get a yield. Design for both immediate and long-term returns from your efforts. You can't work on an empty stomach. Set up positive feedback loops to build the system and repay your investment. So the idea here is, no matter what you're doing, try to get some kind of a yield. Try to get a yield of beauty. It could be just beauty from flowers. It could be a yield of some greens. It could be a yield of your friends like to come over more often. So because your place is really cool. So design for some kind of a yield. So here is a little video from the about the idea of obtaining a yield.
And I've got news for you. There's no point doing what you do unless it's somehow good for you. Got to get a result or two in the form of something real. Now if you're feeling stressed and not the best and have trouble finding happiness, well, here's one thing I will suggest. Obtain yourself a yield. Obtain yourself a yield. Sustain your energy. Don't drain yourself, maintain yourself, obtain yourself a yield. Now money is not the only yield. You could be making a bigger deal about what you eat for your next meal. You can't run on an empty tank. Ignore the stash of cash in your pocket. Just make a salad with some homegrown rocket. You just have to go out the back and pluck it. Don't need to go to the bank. You gotta work your days for stuff that pays. Not just money, but in many ways. It's time you cleared away the haze and obtain yourself a yield. Obtain yourself a yield of something you can eat. You can produce some things of use with your own have a sleep. And if you feel like there's not enough air, then breathe in very deep. And if you're thirsty, then you order, get yourself a drink of water. And if it's gonna be cold and you're feeling bold, you can cheer yourself a sheep.
As a matter of fact,
In any given moment, there's everything you need. Just look around, it will be found. And obtain yourself a yield. Obtain yourself a yield. Take only what you need. Life's pretty fun when you're getting some, but there's no need for greed. Obtain yourself a yield, and one for others too. Make sure to seal both ends of the deal. What's good for both of you? Yeah, an easy way to do it is to give one to your friends. Because the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never ends. That's right, the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never ends. Yeah, the good things you do come back to you, and the yield just never, ever, ever, ever ends.
So that guy has videos for all the different permaculture principles. So if you want to go look him up and see some more of those. So another attitude principle is that design limits yield, and the way Bill Mollison states this is that the yield of any particular design is limited more by the creativity of the designer than it is by any kind of fundamental laws of nature. And so what can we do in order to we can always find a way to stick another plant into the system, or to get another cycle of nutrients in the system. And so so that's so if we need more yield in the system, we need to think, what can we do from the perspective of design that can enhance that. Mistakes are tools for learning. If you're not making mistakes as you're going through your system, then probably you're not optimally learning as you're doing it. So mistakes are a sign that you are trying to do things better. And here's Buckminster Fuller talking about this idea of starting at your front door.
I've been able to live now for almost a half century on the frontier without anybody guaranteeing me anything or telling me what to do. I've learned how to survive there, and one of the things I do is never to try to persuade anybody to. You don't try to sell anything. You see what needs to be done and you do it.
everyone I know.
So that was Buckminster Fuller, who is who's kind of an early pioneer, kind of the one of the original modern ecological designers. He designed the geodesic dome, and he was looking at, okay, how can the systems of the earth take care of everybody? And the guy you're seeing right now, John Todd, he was very much influenced by Buckminster Fuller. So there's a whole generation of ecological designers, sort of the ones that we stand on their shoulders, and they were inspired by Buckminster Fuller. John Todd developed the concept of living machines. So how can we take this billion-year intelligence of biology and purifying water and create systems for people? And he makes these beautiful systems that are partly machines, partly tanks and pumps and filters, and partly biology. And the biology is self-organizing, self-regulating, and you put that together to make something that's beautiful and also treats waste. We'll talk more about those later. Rules for resource use. So this is ranked from regenerative to degenerative. So there are some resources that when you use them, the amount is increased. There are some resources that are lost if you don't use them. Like if you don't eat strawberries, or if they're getting ripe, then they'll just get too ripe and rot, and you won't be able to use them. There are some things that are unaffected by use, like air. We can breathe as much air as we want, and it doesn't really affect it. There are some things that are lost by use, and there are some things that are polluted or degraded with use. And so this is the so we want to start up here with use resources like this as much as possible that increase with use, and then use resources that pollute or degrade the system with their use as little as possible. And so here's, I'll leave this up for a minute, you can come back and look at this, but this is another formulation of the principles, and here there's 20 of them here, and you can take a look at these. And again, sometimes it's useful to look at several different formulations of the principles, and in your textbook you'll see even a different formulation of the principles. Another principle that Bill Mollison came up with is this relationship between work and inputs and outputs to a system, and work and pollution. So Buckminster Fuller quote again: "Pollution is nothing but the resources we are not harvesting. We allow them to disperse because we've been ignorant of their value." So if we've got human sewage, and we don't have any way to harvest the nutrients in that and use it in the system, then it becomes a waste product and a problem, and pollution really, because we don't have a way of using that. So in permaculture, the way that's typically stated, if we have unmet needs or inputs into our system that aren't being supplied by the output of some other part of the system, so the output of one part of the system should be the input to the next one. If we don't have those connections made, then we have work. So if we have things that need to go into the system that aren't provided by the system, that's the definition of work. And then if we have unused outputs or unused inputs, in other words, we've got outputs from one system that aren't connected to the input of something else, then that's another the definition of that is pollution. So pollution is outputs that we haven't found a use for yet, and work is inputs to the system that we haven't found a way to plug in the output from another system in. So again, this is very much systems thinking perspective. So here's a way of thinking about the permaculture design process as kind of a big pyramid. It starts at the foundation, the ethics, the care of the people, care of the earth, and share the surplus or fair shares. And then it goes up through the design principles as the next level of the pyramid. So we've got all these principles from nature that we've just been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so here. And then we start to think about design methods, which is what we'll talk about in the next lecture. And this is what are some formal ways in which we can design things. And then that feeds into strategies. In other words, there are methods of design, kind of these that could be applied to design anything. But then we have particular strategies, like, okay, how are we going to get water? Well, we're going to get it from rain. We're going to get it from a well. We're going to get it, a bunch of different ways. And so those are strategies. And then techniques and specifications would be, a particular method of rainwater harvesting or a particular kind of composting toilet. And then that all comes together in a design solution. And so you notice that oftentimes, if you're not familiar with this whole process, you jump right here and you'll fall in love with a particular technique or or technique of some kind, like a particular kind of composting toilet. And you just try to find ways to use that in every design that you come into. And really you should hold off on choosing the particular techniques until you've kind of gone through this process. And then that creates a design solution. Okay, and then that feeds back. So once you've got the design solution, you can go back and take a look at, does it meet the ethics and in line with the principles, and then you can come back out again. So it's an iterative process. It goes, you come up with an idea, use the methods of design, come up with some strategies, pick some particular technologies, implement the solution, and then you rethink it again. What is it working? What isn't working? And then you go. What isn't working? And then you go through the process. So design is an iterative process. I think it's a mistake to think, well, I got to get everything right the first time, because it'll never happen. And it's best to start somewhere, and then you'll learn through this iterative process. And we'll do this exercise in class tomorrow. And so I'm going to just. I think we're just about to the end here. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have David Holmgren, who is the other developer of the permaculture design methodology with Bill Mollison. And he's going to kind of summarize his approach to ethics and design principles. He has a book called Permaculture Pathways Beyond Sustainability.
The design principles are thinking tools that, when used together, allow us to creatively redesign our environment and our behaviour in a world of less energy and resources. I've displayed them in a circle like the numbers on a clock face to aid our memory. This arrangement is also suggestive of a design process, albeit a very loose one, where we start with principle 1 and move through considering how all 12 principles might apply to a particular issue, problem or opportunity that's the focus of our attention. This process leads us naturally back to principle 1, reminding us that designing often involves many iterations or cycles before we are happy with an outcome. The analogy of the clock can be taken further in thinking of the ethics at the centre of the clock face, informing and underpinning our consideration of each principle. The circle is also evocative of a wheel, where the ethics provide the hub and the design principles are 12 spokes that, through their creative tension, keep the wheel balanced and working in harmony. In any design process, it's important to consider all 12 principles together, as they provide different perspectives that restrain and balance one another. Without an intuitive grounding in whole systems thinking, application of one of the design principles can lead to dysfunctional or even unethical decisions and actions. Nevertheless, it is useful and often necessary to focus on one design principle at a time when we explore them, as we have done in this presentation. They each provide a very different perspective on whole systems thinking and design that can be understood at varying levels of depth and application. We can think of each of the 12 principles as a door into the potentially confusing labyrinth of whole systems thinking. Now, the definition of each principle and its separation from others reflects the origins and ongoing evolution of permaculture concepts and teaching over 30 years that's distilled in this presentation and explained in depth in Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. Now, while nothing is ever the last word, the extraordinary spread of permaculture around the world and the very positive response to this distillation of permaculture design principles from those who are at the front lines of ecological design suggests that these design principles do reflect something of more enduring value. Finally, we should remember that the best of ecological design in any field will often be informed by a range of traditions, concepts and frameworks that may have developed prior to or in parallel with permaculture concepts and design principles. To quote another systems thinking adage, the map is not the territory. Just because something is not labelled permaculture does not exclude the possibility that it might be an excellent example of permaculture principles. Similarly, just because something might be labelled permaculture does not ensure that it's an appropriate application of all or even most of the 12 design principles. What we can do is use permaculture ethics and design principles as guidelines in considering the proliferation of creative design and action from any and every source. With these tools, we can find the best solutions in the most unlikely places and avoid the risk that such useful thinking tools could lose their open-ended, organic and flexible nature that is their greatest strength.